I found out about the September 11th attacks while I was in high school. I was going to my biology class, and there they had it on TV. At first I was thinking it was like a faux scenario or something, and no one said anything, and then pretty much the next class after that we were all just watching the news too, and nobody really knew what to think. I remember I grew up on South 48th Street in Lincoln, which is a pretty big street, or a pretty busy street, and there people normally go 40 miles an hour except during rush hour, and I remember the entire week afterwards it seemed like everyone was going like 15 miles an hour. You could tell everyone had that on their head.
When the attack happened, my wife and I happened to be on vacation that day, that week, and we were planning to kind of take a road trip up into northern Nebraska, and I was getting the car ready to go, and I happened to overhear something on television that caught my eye, and the first plane had crashed into one of the towers. And I thought, oh my God, what's happened now? And I called to my wife and I said, something big's happened in New York. And we sat down and started watching, and of course we canceled any plans to travel because we didn't know if war was coming or what was going on. And we sat glued to the television and watched the second plane hit the second tower, and we just kind of prayed for the people that were lost in those explosions in the building when it fell.
When the 9/11 attack came and when the first plane hit the tower, I was still at home, but I turned on the TV about 5 minutes after it happened and couldn't believe what I was seeing. And then, of course, like everybody else, I think was probably glued to the television for the rest of the day. Saw everything else live. Before things actually even settled down a little bit that day, we were receiving word that all aircraft were grounded. They couldn't even take off on a local flight. Well, thank goodness spray season was over, because we had crop dusters on the field that had been taking off on a regular basis, but they had settled down some, so that wasn't a problem. But we were shut down for quite a while before we were given the okay to fly. General aviation basically fell apart. The price of airplanes, privately owned small planes, dropped dramatically. You couldn't begin to sell one. You couldn't afford the insurance on one. As the value of the planes dropped, the insurance went up.
When the attacks happened, at first I thought it was kind of a joke. I remember being here in my office and I was working on something, and somebody had come in the front door and said a plane had flown into the World Trade Center. And at first I thought it was kind of a joke. It seemed real surreal to me. And as I thought about it and overheard this person talk a little bit, then I had thought, well, it was probably a private plane that accidentally flew into the World Trade Center. And we had other people come into the newspaper, and we had other people call in saying what we had heard or what we knew about it. And then I knew it was pretty serious. And 12 years ago, our use and exposure to the internet wasn't as great as it is now. So we really didn't have the internet type of information at our fingertips like we do now. So I can remember going home and turning on CNN, and I thought I was going to be home and watch this for like 15 or 20 minutes. And I sat at home for a couple of hours, and the first plane had hit, and then I saw footage of the second plane hitting, and then the third plane, I think it was in New Jersey or Pennsylvania, wherever that was, that had went down, and then there was the whole Pentagon thing. And I remember thinking, what's happening here? Our world is changing. No longer are we safe. I can always remember thinking about war and thinking about terrorist attacks and thinking they were isolated to other parts of the world. But then it dawned on me that we're not safe here anymore. That from that day forward, our life was going to change. That everything we did, everybody we talked to, everywhere we went, all of a sudden, we had to think about terrorism. And oddly enough, during that time, I was supposed to be part of a delegation from the state of Nebraska. It was like a couple days later it was supposed to happen. And we were going to tour Vandenberg Air Force Base in California and watch a test launch of intercontinental ballistic missiles into the Pacific Ocean. And that had been canceled. And I guess I never equated how the cancellation of that was tied to the terrorism attacks. But it was explained to me that during those first few days, the government didn't know what was going to happen, and that maybe none of us were safe. So it was obviously canceled. And from that day forward, for the next 12 years, which is where we're at now, everything is different. You go to the airport, everything is different. You get on a train, it's different. You go to a bus station, it's different. You go into metropolitan areas, there's more security. There's no doubt that the 9/11 attacks changed every facet of our life. For me, it was kind of like losing innocence.
Alright, well, when 9/11 happened, we were in kindergarten. So about 5, 6, around that.
Tiny.
And I remember our teacher turning on the TV, and we sat there and watched it we watched the footage of it happening. Do you remember?
I don't remember being in school when it happened. I do remember going home after school and it being on the TV in the living room, my mom like crying and freaking out. Something serious was definitely happening that day.
Yeah, I just remember thinking that, something bad happened. Obviously, I didn't have the full enough knowledge to know what exactly was going on. But I do remember thinking like something bad
Right.
happened.
Definitely didn't grasp the whole idea of an attack on our country, but I'm glad I know about it now because we're probably the last generation that remembers anything
I know.
about it.
Yeah, that's for sure. Like today, I don't think anyone really even said much about it.
That's what we remember from 9/11.
When the attacks on September 11th happened, I was in 5th grade. Actually, we were in music class, and we got done with that and went to Mrs. Curry's classroom, and she had the TV on with all of the news stories going, and we were all kind of just in shock about that and watched it. But I remember Mrs. Curry handling it very well. But that's where I was on September 11th, 2001.
When the attacks happened, I was getting ready to go to work and getting my 2 small children at that time ready to go to preschool and to daycare. And I remember listening to Good Morning America, and all of a sudden Charlie Gibson said, "We don't know exactly what's going on, but it appears that an airplane has hit one of the Twin Towers." And at that point, when I left, they were speculating that it was a small plane and it was probably something that was accidental. By the time I got the kids where they needed to go and got here to Jefferson Community Health Center, word was out and it was a terrorist attack, and they pretty well, knew that it was a bad thing. Both towers had been hit by the time I got to work. The thing I remember probably the most from that day is that I was going through our cafeteria to get a cup of tea and noticed on the TV that something big was happening. And I stood with Dr. Rick Blatney Sr. and several other staff members and watched one of the towers fall live. And what I remember is we were all just stunned. Throughout the day, one of my kids had a dentist appointment. I watched part of the news coverage from the back office at Dr. Jack Wesch's office. But everywhere we went all day, people were just hungry for news and hungry for some kind of assurance that there were going to be survivors. I remember the news reports that the hospitals were all geared up and they were ready to help people, and there was no one coming. It was a hard day, and it still is. The next day, The other thing I always remember when I think of 9/11 is my husband and I were driving out to Husker Harvest Days. And of course there was no air traffic. And you don't realize how weird it is to look in the sky and see no jet trails and no airplanes until it really is silent. And that was what probably really brought home to me what kind of a situation we were in. So 9/11, everyone has memories of where we were, what we were doing, and who we were with. And I hope we learn from it and move forward.
I was in 7th grade, and I remember I was in social studies class, and everything kind of shut down that day. We heard an announcement, and we could turn TVs on and watch what had happened. I remember even after school it was a big deal because even MTV had news coverage on it, and so I think we all kind of grasped it was a big deal. I remember gas lines, lines for gas being extremely long, and just kind of that feeling of uncertainty. And then about 5 years later, when I was a senior in high school, I got to go visit the site, and there was a timeline, and everything kind of became real. I could picture everything I saw in the news, the place covered in dust and people running, with blood on them and paper falling from the sky. When I went and visited, the site was clean, but reading the timeline just brought me back, and standing there made me a little bit emotional.